But in a long poem, I was conscious, this is a long poem, and you need some variety. You need some changes of pace. But the reason for doing it all, the reason for doing it with poetry rather than prose, is not simply because I think poetry is beautiful and I like the sound of it, and it's not only that there is a kind of chant that enchants you, but it's also the musicality of it, which I think works in ways we're not entirely conscious of.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Priest and poet Malcolm Guite has become something of a regular on the Habit Podcast, and yet familiarity breeds ever more amazement at what a gift Malcolm is to the reading public. Galahad and the Grail is book one of Merlin's Isle and Arthuriad. This four-part epic poem in ballad form will retell the whole story of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. In this episode, Malcolm and I talk about poetic forms, the beginnings of his own work on Arthur, and the old legends about how the Grail got to the British Isles. Malcolm Guite, I'm so happy to have you back on the Habit Podcast again, and I'm so excited about Galahad and the Grail. I've been looking forward to this for a long time, and here it is.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's lovely to be back. I enjoyed our last encounter. I think we briefly became the Hobbit podcast on that occasion.
That's right. Before we recorded, you said you've been glad to know that Galahad and the Grail has been meeting readers in the ways that you hoped it would be meeting readers. Could you say more about that?
Well, it's written in this kind of rhythmic, almost incantatory poetic form, the ballad, and I wanted there to be something of both chant and enchantment about it. I'm trying to as it were, as Coleridge says, remove the film of familiarity and invite people into a genuinely more enchanted, more numinous world, a world of mutuality and courteous exchange that's very different from the sort of material and mechanistic paradigms that we've been forced to live in for the last couple of 100 years.
That's kind of where that idea of escaping that mechanistic approach to the universe, it really is where the whole thing started, if I'm not mistaken, because you had written for the Lost Tales of Sir Galahad years ago. You wrote that piece about the Nighthead.
Yeah. So I wrote it, and it was writing that. I had been wanting for decades to finally write an Arthuriad, a long epic cycle about it. But of course, it was so important, I kept putting it off. And one of my problems was form. Was how do I find the form that works for this? Actually, the form was staring me in the face. I just finished a big book on Coleridge, showing how brilliantly and delicately he used the ballad form. How he took that traditional kind of folk form, oral form, and turned it into this very delicate instrument. So I realized, he'd shown me the way it could be done. But the piece I wrote for that, the brief was an interesting brief. It had to be recognizably the Galahad that we see in the Arthurian sources, the Galahad in Mallory, or I think your retelling is by somebody called Pyle, I think, but he's just tweaking Mallory, really. So it had to be recognisably that character, but it had to be a completely new adventure. And there's a pat phrase in Mallory, and indeed in Pyle's retelling, where he simply says, Galahad many other more adventures in the woods, and which are never written down. So the idea was to write down a missing adventure. And what emerged in it for me, it's actually the closest. I hope I'm aiming to write at what Lewis and Tolkien called a mythopoeic level, which is not direct allegory, but as Lewis said of the Lord of the Rings, it's working at such a deep symbolic level that it's as in Lewis's words, continuously suggestive of incipient allegories, as it were. But the closest I got to anything like a more explicit allegory was precisely in that, and it was about mechanism. It was about the free flowing spirit, if you like, of the Naiad, embodied in her stream. The stream is dammed and polluted, but the person who's done it is somebody whom she once loved and who once loved her, but who has gradually become a mechanism. He's set his. The kind of I wasn't consciously thinking of it, but afterwards people pointed out that I was probably echoing the line from Gandalf about Saruman, or no, I think it's from Treebeard about Saruman, which is that he has a mind of metal and wheels.
Yeah.
And in the debut, as it is in the kind of denouement of my story, they realise that he's ceased to be human. He's worshipped mechanism so much. I think is behind the mask of hardened steel, no human face remained, just springs and bolts and cogs and wheels, all rusty, worn and stained. And the maiden says, "How can that be? He was flesh and blood." And then this was, I suppose, the key part of it. "I see," sighed good Sir Galahad, "the trap he set himself. He set his mind on turning cogs, he set his heart on wealth. And where he set his mind and heart, his soul flowed in their wake. For sometimes we ourselves become the idols that we make." Yeah. We dumb ourselves down to the size of our own machines. I fear it's happening again with AI. So in a sense, what I'm saying about this particular necromancer, I'm saying about the Western scientific mindset when it totalizes everything, when it thinks it really has accounted for everything. Yeah. I'm not saying there isn't a very proper place for both science and the invention of mechanism, but it has to be in its place and not totalized and turned into a god or into the world.
Science is so good at what it's good at.
Exactly. Yeah.
But it's not, as you said, it's not a good.
It's not a final account. I mean, it's not a. I mean, you don't have to go. I mean, in a sense, it seems to me we've not really got as far in the 21st century as Aristotle got. Several hundred years BC. I mean, Aristotle, as you know, in his metaphysics, he talks about causation, and he thinks the causation of anything, whether it's my pipe or a tower block or a car or anything, says it has four causations. It's got first cause, formal cause, efficient cause, and final cause. Yeah. Now, first cause is how anything comes to be at all, which is a mystery. Formal cause is the whole question of what makes a form. If a plant is a plant, even though the matter in the plant is changing all the time, the form of the rose remains. Yeah. What is that form? Final is what a thing is for. Efficient cause is the actual mechanical stuff of what it's made of. Yeah. And we know a huge amount more about that than Aristotle did. Our science is entirely a science of efficient causes. It's on one plane. It's about action and reaction. It's about predicting chemical reactions or analyzing atomic reactions or electronic reactions. That is all efficient cause. But it doesn't even ask, let alone answer the question, where did this come from in the first place? Where did all this come from in the first place? How does this sustain its form? What is the beauty and cohesion? What is the synthesis that's holding the bits together? And of course, it never dares to ask the question of meaning and purpose, which is what is it all for? Now, you might say as a discipline, science ought to clear those questions out of the way, leave it to the theologians and metaphysicians, and just do the efficient cause stuff. And if they were consciously doing that, saying, that's as far as we can go, now over to you guys, that would be fine. Yeah. But they're not. They've forgotten what they excluded, and they think that what they excluded just isn't there at all. So they're saying, that's it. Now we know the mechanism of the way DNA works. All other question, that's the solution to everything. And that is not the solution to everything. It's an account of process, of efficient cause. So we're stuck in a realm that's deified or absolutized material accounts of things. And it's blindingly obvious that most of the things that make life worth living aren't material at all, like love and beauty and honor and things like that. And also, of course, now this is the really wonderful thing. This is where science may turn out to be on our side after all. It turns out that matter isn't what you thought it was either. That the matter is actually far more mysterious. And is mainly, when you get down to its deepest level, it's a lot of empty space and a series of patterns of possibility and probability about which you can say nothing certain and which changes before your very eyes even as you observe it. So actually, even the materialists are being compelled to a sort of mysticism.
Let's bring this down to something a little more specific.
Yeah, sorry, we went off on a flight there.
No, this is what we expect from Malcolm Guite. But I want to talk about your rhyme scheme.
Yeah, oh, good. I'm glad somebody's talking about it. Yeah, I think
I love this rhyme scheme so much, and the flexibility of that middle part of each stanza that we don't know how many lines.
No, I can expand it or I can contract it. I can do a classic ballad 4-line.
Yeah.
A, B, C, B. So there's only 2 rhyming sounds, the second and the fourth line.
Yeah.
Or I can make that C line, I can do 4 of those or 5 of those if I want a particular effect.
What is the longest string of C lines in the...
I think the longest one, and which I saved for a particularly mystical moment in the quest of Fair Dendraine, when she's having a kind of transfigured vision of nature under the moonrise in an all-night vigil. And I think I go to 7 at least, possibly 8 on that one. I mean, I could find that passage for you if you like.
Oh, I'd love to hear it. Yeah, just so.
And also, I have to say that Stephen Crotts, who's been absolutely magnificent with the illustrations.
Oh, they're amazing.
Did a stunning. Yeah. So this is. Do you know that one of the most lovely phrases in one of the absolutely great songs of Dylan that's haunted me, and it's kind of ghosting my whole poetic approach yet. I love his facility with rhyme. But he says in Mr. Tambourine Man, he says, if you hear vague traces of skipping reels of rhyme to your tambourine in time, I wouldn't pay it any mind. It's just a ragged cloud behind. It's just a shadow you're seeing that he's chasing, you know. And then he's going to eventually, through that, bring you out to dance beneath the diamond sky with one hand waving free. So I'm trying to give you sometimes some skipping reels of rhyme. So here's the bit. This is Dendraine, the heroine of this part of the story, a young woman who has a natural spiritual gift, which has been noticed and is being nurtured by her mother's sister, her aunt, so that she too can be ready for her part in the Grail quest. So it goes like this. Well, I'll, if you don't mind, I'll read you two stanzas. One where I do quite a few, and then this gives you the whole picture.
Yeah, great.
He taught Dendraine, she is the hermitess, she taught Dendraine the way of prayer, the way to still her soul, the way to woo each beast and bird, and know each creature as a word breathed into being by our Lord. For God himself is the true bard, and sings creation through his word. And Dendraine learned from all she heard, and knew each star, each stone, each bird, as parts of one great whole. So we've got about 7 there. By night she kept pure vigil there, and morning came too soon. For she would see the stars wheel by, and hear their music from on high, and feel their influence, and cry in ecstasy when she'd descry a sphere of silver light draw nigh. Then she would lift her eyes and spy above the valley's chalice high the wafer of the moon. And I mean, Stephen Crotts just a genius illustration with that. So that's about as extended as it gets.
Yeah.
But sometimes, you know, in Galahad in the Night, it's just 4 lines.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, you didn't invent that form, did you?
No. So the kind of thing that that Galahad and the Naiad is written in throughout, which was my first venture, you know. So it seemed the maiden paused and quailed, but then she found her voice. I am no longer thrall, she said. I know I have a choice. That's 4 lines, alternating 4 stresses and 3 stresses. Only 2 of the rhymes, the second and the fourth rhyme. That is used throughout early ballad forms. Sure. That's a common ballad meter. Now, what Coleridge did was occasionally to take that in the simplest form, unrhymed third line, and put another couple of lines in there, sometimes just 2, sometimes, and extend the stanza a little bit. And then G.K. Chesterton, clearly learning from Coleridge, used that extended thing, so it's often a 5 or 6 line verse rather than the 4 line verse. Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Sometimes the 7 line verse. He does that in his Ballad of the White Horse. Mm. So, I mean, I had 2 forms of preparation, deliberate preparation for this. One was completely soaking myself in all the medieval sources. Yeah. So I really understood all the different ways the story had already been told. That was one kind of research. But the other, once I knew ballad was the form I wanted to use, was to read lots of the original, if you like, pre-literary ballads, the ballads that were collected by people like Child or Sir Walter Scott, a ballad in its pure folk form.
Yeah.
See all its conventions, see the way it used repeated things, the way it sometimes used internal rhymes within one line, see what's available there.
Yeah.
Then to look at Coleridge, and then to look at Chesterton, and then to say to myself, I think I can take this a bit further. I can develop it in another way. But you don't want to overdevelop it. You don't want to, do you know what I mean? You've got to. But in a long poem, I was conscious, this is a long poem, and you need some variety. You need some changes of pace.
Yeah.
But the reason for doing it all, the reason for doing it with poetry rather than prose, it's not simply because I think poetry is beautiful and I like the sound of it. And it's not only that there is a kind of chant that enchants you, but it's also the musicality of it, which I think works in ways we're not entirely conscious of. Uh-huh. The best analogy for the extra thing that I think I'm bringing by doing this in poetry rather than in prose, the best analogy is probably the analogy of a score for a film. Mm. When you're watching the film, you're loving the images, you're absorbed in the characters, you're there. The music is, in fact, acting on you in all kinds of ways. It's heightening tension or giving a sense of tingling anticipation or a wonderful return of the Shire motif, let's say, when you're watching The Lord of the Rings and you suddenly think music is doing all that stuff. You're not actually concentrating on it. But if you try watching a favourite passage of a favourite film without the music, yeah, you simply go, oh my goodness, this is just flat. Why was I so moved by this? Because the music has been doing its work. So poetry is essentially language that carries its own music with it.
Mm. Yeah.
So this is not only the screenplay, it's the score.
Yeah.
But you don't have to read the music on a film. You hear it, it has the effect. Yeah. I don't want people to be spooked by the fact that this is poetry. On the contrary, I want them to just let the I've worked very hard on the poetry. So the poetry is doing the hard work for you. The poetry will totally look after itself. Like if you read this aloud, which is the best way to enjoy it, you don't have to pause portentously at the end of every line and look meaningful and then go on to the next line. You read it across the lines for the sentence and through the sentences for the sense. Yeah. And suddenly you realise there's this backbeat going on,
mm-hmm. Yeah,
which is carrying you forward and moving your heart in a way that's different from the way the words move your mind.
Yeah, I have to say I was very aware of that as I was reading your poem, Malcolm. I'm certainly, I would say it was more than subliminal, right? I was very aware of it, and I love that analogy of a film score. Because that makes a lot of sense. It felt like a poem in which I was very aware of the score. I wouldn't have thought to put it in those terms. And I don't know if you've ever seen. Sometimes people on the internet will put different music behind the same scene from a film, and it's a completely different scene, as you said. Yeah,
exactly. No, so I think about that. I'm very good friends with the great composer Jack Redford, who composes for TV and film, but also orchestrates other pieces. So he orchestrates for Tom Newman, so he orchestrated and arranged all the music for Skyfall, for example, and arranged, Adele's. So he's an absolute master of this art, and he's occasionally set my poems as choral pieces. And I've been had the good fortune of being in Abbey Road for some of the recordings of these films, with the London Symphony Orchestra, and sitting in the control room and watching the rushes of the film go by while you're same time listening through the speakers to what the orchestra is doing. And they're suddenly saying, no, we need more trombones here. And Jack writes the part. So I love watching skilled people like that at work, and I'm trying to do that in my own small way with the poetic effectiveness.
Can we talk about editing? I don't think of epic poets or balladeers as having editors. I've never heard of Milton's editor or Spencer's editor, but I know you had some editing.
I did, yeah. I was very grateful. In fact, I've had more editing and helpful editing from Pete Peterson at Rabbit Room Press than I actually do normally get from at Canterbury Press when I put in a collection of poems. They're just so great and so great press print, you know. So now there are different. So he doesn't. Mainly, what he flags up is he'll flag up something where I'm used a word that he thinks people will be really unfamiliar with. I'm actually rooting this very much more in Anglo-Saxon words than Latinate or French words. I want it to have that primal sort of clean quality of something ancient. But I do occasionally use them. And quite often I'll make an allusion to something, or I'll use a word because it's a quote, but he won't realise it's a quote. Then I have to ask myself the question, is it necessary to know that this is a quote to get this bit? Or is it just like an Easter egg I've left for someone, you know? Yeah. So he's helped me to, you know, a lot of it is to do with, because I'm writing now for an international audience, I'm not just writing for Englishmen or even Englishmen of my particular type who've had a particular kind of education, but I'm writing this for... He's very good at saying, you know, just getting me to clarify. Yeah. So that's useful. Occasionally it's been, I mean, we actually had to make quite a big editorial decision for the second volume, which involved rewriting, you know, quite a bit. I'm using medieval sources, and they're obviously those were different times, you know, and there are some things that were sort of acceptable then and aren't acceptable now, or there were, you know, there are sort of, and even Mallory, you know, nobody who writes a modern version of Mallory now leaves in some of the stuff, you know. There's quite a lot of gross violence, but there's also all kinds of, you know, there's all sorts of dubious and sometimes incestuous things going on. And you think, actually, do we really need that? Yeah. So there's a little bit of finding I don't want to sanitize this story, and I certainly don't want to modernize it. I want it to be breathing the spirit of a different age so that we can learn. And one of the things, you know, the whole emphasis on chivalry and courtly love, which are much needed, I think, in our own society, I'm bringing in fully. But he certainly helps me to think about how something lands. But he's not the only person I've used for that. So I want this, I mean, I certainly, you know, I'm an adult writing it and I expect adults to read it, but I'm conscious of younger readers and I want to draw them in. And I'm kind of wanting the kind of book I would have loved to have had and found when I was a teenager kind of thing. One of the things that really is a kind of secret aim almost of this is I'm always deeply moved by the story when Lewis tells it, as he does in one or two places, most prominently in Surprised by Joy, of how when he's a kind of atheist teenager, you know, rejecting all that stuff, looking for pure logic, but his guilty pleasure is myths and legends, and how he picks up George MacDonald's Fantastes at a station bookstore. And he says something very remarkable about the effect of reading it, which was, he says, in a way, his imagination was baptized, made ready for something. He says the rest of him took a little bit longer to catch up. The imagination got there first. And if I was to, I mean, I just trying to imagine some slightly, you know, both angry and bewildered, you know, young, hard-boiled atheist lost in the manosphere somewhere, but who likes myths and legends, like that. If I could, and that young man or young woman might be the future C.S. Lewis. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if I could baptize their imagination, if I could be George MacDonald to their Lewis, you know, that would be job done, wouldn't it?
It would be, yeah.
So I kind of, for that reason, I've kind of been road testing. I have I mean, my children are grown up, but I have friends with children of ages from, you know, 9 through to 15 or 16 or whatever. And I've been sending, you know, some of them have volunteered, as it were, to read bits of this to their children or give them to their children to read. So I have been road testing a bit, and that's actually been hugely encouraging. They're going like, give me more, you know. Yeah. So,
love it. All right, I really am going to change the subject now. Tell me about the Glastonbury thorn.
I think this is one of the great symbols of England. I mean, if we think of history as a bit like a tree, that it's rooted somewhere, that it grows, that it develops, that it puts off branches. Well, if there was ever a tree, I mean, we tend to think of the oak tree as the great, you know, the great English oaks, and that's true. But I think the Glastonbury thorn has a special claim. So if you go into the full Glastonbury legend, and by the way, in my book, I very much print the legend. For me, it's the storytelling around Arthur. It's the mythos, you know, the mythopoeic, where the wisdom is. I'm not trying diligently and learnedly to reconstruct an historical Arthur. I'm trying to give you the mythic, resonant, archetypal king. So let's go with the legend. The Glastonbury legend is that Joseph of Arimathea, who features in all the Gospels, and as we know, he's the person who lends his tomb to Jesus, as it were, and therefore he's the person that goes to Pilate and asks for the body. And it's interesting that, given all the controversy about the whole thing, it's rather extraordinary that Pilate grants him the body and says, because, after they've put a guard on the tomb and everything. So in both Roman and Jewish law at that time, you could not refuse the request for a body from kith and kin. So one of the things in the Glastonbury legend is that possibly Joseph is related to Mary in some way, that he's an uncle, say, which would make him Jesus' great uncle. Anyway, he's obviously there when they take Jesus' body down from the cross, and the legend is that he has with him the chalice, the Grail, the chalice that was used at the Last Supper, and that he collects in it some of the blood that comes from the heart of Jesus. Then his body is taken, and then, of course, Jesus is resurrected. And they then... we're all in the gospel so far, but now we're getting to a little bit of legendary embroidery, but, why not? So the story goes that when the body of Jesus goes missing, of course they arrest Joseph of Arimathea, and he says, "Nothing to do with me, mate, a stone was rolled away." But they imprison him, and they intend to starve him to death by putting him in a tower for 40 days. But Jesus appears with the chalice and with the paten and with the bread still from the Passover and gives it to him. And he's sustained, if you like, by Holy Communion. He's fully nourished. It's like Elijah with the bread that the raven brings. And after 40 days, they dig him out and, he said, "Right, I've had my punishment, no double indemnity, I'm still here." But obviously he's a suspicious person. And then the big persecution arises, which we know of from the martyring of Stephen onwards, plus the destruction of Jerusalem is coming. So Jesus, the risen Christ, appears to Joseph and his family and says, "Take these holy things, the chalice, the spear that pierced my heart, the spear of the Roman soldier Longinus," which has now also been given because Longinus has become a Christian through the very act of piercing the heart of Christ. And that's why we know his name. And the paten. And take them away. And in the full Glastonbury legend, Joseph's day job, he's a trader, he's a Phoenician trader trading with Cornwall for tin. Now, that's not entirely impossible. We know there was a trade between the Levant and Cornwall, and tin was really important to the empire because you needed bronze. So he says, "You remember, you took me when I was a little boy." So she said, we went there. Hence, William Blake's "Did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountain green?" So take them back to that mysterious outer island, Albion, and I will show you, when you get there, by miracle, where to stop and where to stay. So
I'm sorry, Malcolm. Let me interrupt you for just a second. You said that, according to the legend, Joseph took young Jesus.
Yeah. So according to the legend, we all have.
I never knew why Blake said his.
Okay, right. Okay, so just quickly, but to go back to that. Sorry, I take these things for granted. It's a problem. So. Lots of people have written books called Jesus, the Missing Years, because, we see him, obviously, in his infancy narratives. We see him when he's 12 in Luke's Gospel,
right?
Staying on in the temple. And then in the Gospels, we don't see him again until he's 30.
Yeah.
So now lots of people have thought about this. I mean, my personal feeling about it is that he's fully God, he's fully human, and every human being is entitled to a bit of privacy in their ordinary family life. And everything he does and says in the Gospels, he does and says for us, and the focus on those final years after his baptism is really what we're allowed to see. But I don't see why we should be hanging around and listening to every conversation he ever had with his mum. I think he's entitled to that. Anyway, lots of people have decided, he must have gone here or he must have gone there. So the full Glastonbury legend is that Joseph takes the young Jesus, the child Jesus, with him on these voyages, get him out of the house. Joseph's getting the other Joseph, Jesus' foster fathers, get on with the carpentry job, and so on. So, Blake reads this legend and is absolutely fascinated by it. And he writes the little song that we call Jerusalem, which is actually part of a longer poem. And he simply asks the open question, and did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green? And was the holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures seen? And did the countenance divine shine forth upon our clouded hills? And was Jerusalem builded here amongst these dark satanic mills? I mean, the answer to the question is probably not. But it's a lovely idea.
Yeah.
So I certainly go with that in my story. So after the resurrection and the ascension, Joseph now has these holy things. Jerusalem is about to be torn to pieces, and literally leveled stone from stone, as Josephus tells us. Mm-hmm. So he and his people get into his boat, and they're guided and they sail and they land. The first place they land, obviously, is where he knows, and he knows the seaways, which is Cornwall. And there's lots of places in Cornwall that claim to be the place. So then they walk inland, and they walk from Cornwall into Somerset. And when they come to a place called Glastonbury, there's a hill there, which is called, well, there are two hills. There's the big hill with the Torah, and there's another smaller hill. And the smaller hill is called Wearill. And it's literally spelled weary. It's pronounced Wearill, but it's spelled weary all.
Okay.
And Glastonbury literally means hill of glass, hill that you can see through. Oh. So the story is Joseph is leaning on his staff because he's weary on Wearill Hill. Mm-hmm. And suddenly the staff takes root and puts out branches and bursts into blossom, and it becomes a flowering hawthorn. And he takes this as the sign that this is where he is to build a church, which in this telling of the legend is the very first Christian church in England. And people believe that for centuries, and that's why there's a big monastery. And there was a great abbey there because it was around the Prisca church, the Prisca Antiqua, the early church. And he dedicates it to Mary, and he carves an image of her. Anyway, so this is now the thorn is still. This is the extraordinary thing, is that the thorn became a holy thing, and the particular thing about the thorn, and this is attested in many, many accounts, is that it has a double blossom. It blossoms as you would expect it to blossom in spring, but it also blossoms on Christmas Eve, and this is always taken to be the sign of the thorn witnessing to the incarnation and the birth of Christ. And there was a tradition that the Christmas blossoms were always, the first of the Christmas blossoms were taken and sent to the royal family, as they still are, just before Christmas. Now, so deep is this link between the notion of the sacred and a kind of sacral kingship, that when the Puritans came in the Puritan Revolution in Cromwell and, were trying to get rid of what they called popish superstitions and, clear out what they regarded as the lumber of medieval superstition, they understood this. So they did the unthinkable thing. They executed their anointed king, and they brought Charles I to trial. And literally on the day and at the time that they beheaded the king, they sent a squad of people to uproot the Glastonbury thorn.
Really?
But, of course, everybody, they were all royalists in that neck of the wood, and everybody knew this was coming, and they all took signs of the thorn, cuttings and slips of it, and then planted them around Glastonbury in their gardens. And there's one which is which is growing in the churchyard of St John's Church there. But every time anybody tried to pull it up, basically people came and replanted it. And there are signs of it planted all over England. There's one in one of the Cambridge College gardens, which I was once asked to kind of bless. So there's something very, very rooted about this. And there's something about the thorn tree, about the blossom, about the thorns representing the crown of thorns, and the blossom representing the resurrection. And there is still one on Wearill Hill, and there's still people who kind of guard and look after it, and there's still people who want to tear it up. It's a kind of contested but continuous thing. So it becomes really significant in my poem. In my poem, there's both an outer Glastonbury and an inner Glastonbury. The inner Glastonbury is Avalon. So Glastonbury in history became associated with the Isle of Avalon. And of course, in Joseph's day, the Somerset levels would have been much more flooded, and it would have been almost like an island, that bit, that would have been very swampy. But anyway, so there's some reflections on it by Chesterton, and there's an entire book with beautiful woodcut illustrations about the thorn. And there are all kinds of associated stories, like the Puritan henchman who hacked the thorn down, got a splinter of the thorn in his eye and went blind, and then was healed of his blindness by a priest. Now, that's an exact echo of the story of Longinus, who, in the legend, when he pierces Christ's heart, he goes blind, and then a Christian disciple lays hands on him and his eyes are opened, and he not only sees again, but he sees that Jesus Christ was indeed the Son of God, and, he becomes a Christian. So, it's a story that keeps recurring.
And isn't it also a legend that all the hawthorn trees on the island came from that first one?
Yeah, well, yeah, and in fact, this is the extraordinary thing, is when the botanists got onto it, as they inevitably would, they discovered that, most English hawthorns are native hawthorns. But these Glastonbury hawthorns are actually genetically related to hawthorns that grow in the Middle East.
Is that right?
Yeah, so there's something going on there. Now, there's lots of other reasons why hawthorns might have been brought from the Middle East or whatever, but they are definitely different. And they do have, the thing that distinguishes them is this double blossom. That they blossom, in midwinter as well as in spring.
Love it. So good. So it was. I thought the Glastonbury thorn would give you reasons to give us kind of the big picture. Just as I hope, that's sort of a big picture of what Joseph of Arimathea and the Grail have to do with all this story. And thank you for explaining what I love the hymn of the Blake song of Jerusalem.
Yeah, it's kind of an unofficial national anthem of England. That
I just never understood what it was talking about.
So when Blake was training as an artist and engraver, as a young man, as a teenager, he just had to go and draw the stuff he was told to go and draw in Westminster Abbey or whatever. But the very first time, it's one of the earliest pieces of Blake's art that we've got, original art. The very first time that his apprentice master said, "Okay, now you can do a composition of any subject you like," partly to see how well he did Joseph of Arimathea arriving at Cornwall.
Is that right?
Among the rocks. So from really early, he was onto that.
Well, tell me what's coming up. We've got Galahad and the Grail is the first of the
first of four.
First of four.
Yeah. So the next one. So the other one thing I need to say, this one could run and run, is so. Aristotle, when he's giving in his Poetics, he talks about how to write an epic, what an epic should consist of. It has to be gods and men and so on. But he talks about beginning in medias res, in the midst of things.
Yeah.
So if you think, for example, of the Aeneid, by the way, my word Arthuriad, the whole sequence, the total of the four, is called Merlin's Isle and Arthuriad. People have been puzzled by that word. Arthuriad is modelled on the word Aeneid, about Aeneas, or Iliad, So Ilium being the old word for Troy. So there's going to be. So I've begun with the Grail cycle, but chronologically, and of course I keep looking right back to the Joseph story, but lots of. But chronologically, in the arc of the story of Arthur, we're about 2/3 of the way through with the Grail. Merlin's already, departed by the time the Grail story arrives. So this is a book which is going to have, if you have the book now, what's coming next is 2 prequels and a sequel.
Okay.
So there's going to be The Coming of Arthur. That's the next one. That's coming out in November. Then there's going to be Days of the Round Table, which will be a big collection of all the stories you love about the Knights of the Round Table. The adventures of Lancelot and Gawain and the Green Knight and Tristan and Isolde and the adventures of Percy. It's, compendium of adventures.
Yeah.
That gets us up, if you like, to where we started with the Grail. Obviously,
Yeah.
And then the final book will be The Passing of Arthur. And people are it's kind of going to, once it's all out, so Coming of Arthur is November.
Yeah.
Days of the Round Table is 27, and I think fall of 27, and then The Passing of Arthur, the final one, about the end of the Round Table, and the Arthur being taken miraculously to Avalon for the healing of his wound, and the promise that Arthur will return someday. All of that. That will come in the final volume, which will be in the spring of 2028. Now, once they're all out, people will, and this is a bit like the Chronicles of Narnia, this.
Yeah.
People are going to have a choice. They can read them in the order they were published, book, 2, prequel, sequel, or they can rearrange them on their shelves and they can read the story from start to finish. Coming of Arthur, Days of the Round Table, Galahad and the Grail, The Passing of Arthur.
Okay.
And I'm going to leave it to the nerds to happily fight out which is the best way to do that. Obviously, I've written them in a certain way, starting with this, and then I want people, when they're reading the first book, reading rather the second book, the Coming of Arthur, say, "Oh my goodness, I know where this is going to lead," and so. Whether you have foresight or remembrance depends on the order.
Yeah. Coming of Arthur is written.
Yep, completely. It's just about gone out now. I think I've done all the proofreading and the layout is done. I think the last beautiful finishing touches are being given to the wonderful illustrations even as we speak. So that will be out in November, I think, or even possibly October.
When I saw the rough illustrations months ago, I couldn't believe those were the rough ones. They were.
I know. I really want to give tribute to Stephen Krotz here. I mean, he was kind of on my rider. I have to say, when I was trying to work out who do I bring this to, who do I ask to publish this, and obviously Rabbit Room was in the frame, but because I thought they'll take it seriously, but I was like, they'll do it beautifully.
Yeah.
But I kind of said, look, if I give you this book, I want Stephen Krotz. I'd already seen his work, and I thought he's just perfect for this. Yeah. And he really is perfect for it. I feel like he's exploring the same. He's not simply taking what I've given him and illustrating only what's there. Yeah. He and I are looking together into the mystery at the very heart of the story, and we're both drawing from it.
Yeah.
And we're getting to the point now where my own imagination is being formed by his beautiful artwork.
I love it.
The artwork will start to influence the poetry as well as being drawn from the poetry.
Yeah. Stephen has done covers for 4 of my books. So I just love having a celebrity illustrator on the case.
Yeah, no, he's exceptionally good. And still developing and growing all the time, I think, He's so it was one of the thrills of doing this was to be able to do a kind of quest of our own through all this very countryside that's so formative. So we went to Glastonbury together, we went down through Cornwall, went to the Castle of Tintagel where Arthur is conceived and born, and it was absolutely fantastic. We saw Merlin's cave there. It was superb. So
good. Okay, so Coming of Arthur is written, but you're still... have you written the other 2 books?
I'm a little over halfway through volume 3 now.
Okay. All right. Well...
So, I think that's due with Rabbit. I've got to hand it over to Pete, by December this year. But in fact, because then there's less time for the next volume, I'm hoping to have it really done, ideally by the end of the summer, end of September, that kind of time. But you can't tell, sometimes it flows really well. Yeah. Sometimes you have to go for a long walk,
Yeah.
The real danger is interruption. I've had to completely change my way. Because obviously the thing I'm best known for up till now is the sonnet. Yeah. And the sonnet is a kind of miniature. It's a concentrated form.
Right.
You know where it's going to end before you've started it.
Yeah.
it's got its own skill set, which I've kind of to some degree mastered. But the thing is, I can, at a pinch, I can write a sonnet in an airport lounge, but I can't write an epic in an airport lounge. If I can't write an epic, on the odd Sunday afternoon, I've got to clear every time I do it. I have to read my way back into it, refamiliarize myself, tune my mind back to the ballad meter. That takes about a day. Mm-hmm. And if I do that and then something else crops up, that's all to waste. I then have to do it all over again. So I need blocks of at least 3, better still 4 untrammeled days to get on with it at all. And trying to organize those is more difficult than you'd think. I mean, obviously, at the moment, I can't really organise them because I'm responding to requests and so on to publicise the book, which is, I'm very, very thrilled that it's had the reception it's had. I mean, it's had very good reviews, but also not just in the religious blogs and newspapers, but in the Times and the New World, and happily, it's sort of. I think it debuted in terms of being a national bestseller in America at number 15 in Publishers Weekly last week.
That's wonderful.
So, interestingly, Poets Fair, I was very entertained when Pete sent me the link because it says hardback non-fiction. So I thought, this is great. The long, delicate debate about the historicity of Arthur has been decisively concluded by Publishers Weekly. We're saying definitively it is not fiction.
Well, I'm glad that this is finally settled. Well, Malcolm, I'm going to let you get back to what you. I want you to get back to writing these poems. So why don't we hang up and you go try to knock out a few.
Well, thanks. Anyway, thanks for the conversation. And as I say, I'm starting to get feedback now from people who've been reading it to their children or reading it out loud, couples reading it out loud to each other, families, book groups, doing what I want, which is to celebrate it as a kind of music of its own, speaking it out loud.
Well, it's a beautiful book.
Anyway, well, thanks. It's good to talk to you again.
Yeah, thanks, Malcolm. See you soon.
Okay, every blessing. Bye.
Bye. The Habit Podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. You can support their work, including this podcast, by becoming a member. Visit rabbitroom.com/membership. Special thanks as well to Taylor Leonard for letting us use her song Diamonds as the theme music for the Habit Podcast. You can learn more about Taylor and follow her work at taylorleonard.com. The Habit Membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.